Today's video is going to be about how Christopher Columbus, or Cristobal Colon, was actually a bronze man. He was not a Caucasian. Historically, that depiction is very inaccurate, and today we're going to look at the proofs of him being a bronze man. So as you can see here, I screenshotted this off of the Met's Museum website. The Met's Museum is located in New York City. And here on their website, right here, this painted portrait, the title of it is Portrait of a Man Said to be Christopher Columbus. Now, it's very interesting that they use those words because when you say the word said to be this or said to look like this, that means you're going off of hearsay and you actually have no real full proof that this is what that person looks like. So as we can read here on the left side, it says, painted in Rome by one of the outstanding Venetian masters of the High Renaissance, this badly damaged portrait purports to show Christopher Columbus. Again, purports to show. They don't know for sure. That's what that means. The inscription identifies him as the Ligurian Colombo, the first to enter by ship into the world of the Antipodes 1519. I may have said those wrong, it's fine. But the writing is not entirely trustworthy. They even admit it. And the date 1519 means that it cannot have been painted from life as Columbus died in 1506, correct? There are other quite different portraits that also claim to show Columbus. Okay, so there are different portraits of Columbus that don't necessarily look like this. And they continue, nonetheless, from an early date, our picture became the authoritative likeness. So basically they just said, hey, this is the photo that we choose, or the painting that we choose of Christopher Columbus. It doesn't necessarily mean it's historically accurate. This is just what we chose to show. In 1814, the painting was part of the collection of Prince Talleyrand and was exhibited at the Palais Royal in Paris. So they just showed some dude, we don't even know who this is, in Paris. So again, they basically admit that there are different interpretations of what Christopher Columbus looked like, and they don't know which one is correct. They don't even know for sure who this guy is. They just put it up there and said, this is Christopher Columbus. But as we will see going through this video, Christopher Columbus being depicted as a Caucasian is historically inaccurate. And that's going to change our perspective on a lot of things, and we'll get into that as well. This is a very good video from Kurimeo on YouTube. So you can see, you can type this in and look at the video for yourself, and I'm giving credit where credit is due. We're going to watch this short little clip of this clip of a documentary of this man basically describing what Christopher Columbus actually looked like historically. Because remember, in 1492, around that time, the Caucasians over there in Europe were just getting out of war with the Moorish Empire, okay? We all know that colloquially, when you speak of the Moors, you're speaking of bronze people, okay? So they had just gotten out of war with them. So there were bronze people in Europe, and they were plentiful in number to the point where either they had to flee, or if they had no place to go, they had to stay and convert, because the Moors were Islamic and the British were Christians. And so many of the Moors, or us over in the UK British area, converted into Christianity just so they wouldn't be persecuted. Christopher Columbus did the same thing, and he was one of the special cases because he was actually part of a nobility. He wasn't just a sailor, okay, and he did not want to lose his nobility status by being exiled or killed, because we know how the Christians were doing over there at that time. They just kill you if you didn't want to convert. So he just said, hey, in order to keep my nobility, I might as well just convert from Islamic to Christianity. And this guy is going to mention a word for those bronze people that converted to Christianity just to survive, and not necessarily because they actually wanted to be Christians.
This is a mystery that God has kept for a long time. Because we've said that Christopher Columbus is from Italy. No, he's from Portugal. No, he's from Spain. Well, where is he really from? Well, they said that he was from Genoa, Italy, but his Italian writing is horrible. But his Castilian is perfect, So, so be it as it may, recently there is a growth, an exponential growth of discoveries that point to the fact that Christopher Columbus, first of all, his name is not Columbus. His name, and not because I'm Hispanic with Sanchez surname and Martinez and so forth, but his name is Colon. And so...
And catch that. And be aware of what these people are telling you, because they're not even telling you his real name. He was not born in British, so how could his name be Christopher Columbus? Just like if somebody's born in Mexico, they have what we call a Spanish name. If it's Jesus, Fernando, you're not going to say Jesus Fernando. You're going to say Jesus Fernando. You're going to say it correctly because that is what the name is. So they're not even telling you his real name. So why would you trust them to tell you what he actually looks like? Especially considering what they depict of him is inaccurate based off of the history. Let's continue.
In Spanish, we have it right, Cristobal Colón. So his real name is Salvador Zarco. His real name is Salvador Zarco. All right, but now recently we've discovered that Christopher Columbus, Cristobal Colón, was known as a quote-unquote Marano. Christopher Columbus, Cristobal Colón, was known as a quote-unquote Marano. Marano? The Maranos are those that were forced to convert to Roman Catholicism, that were Sephardim, and then they were forced to eat pork, which is very unkosher, and then they were called Marano, pigs, swine, because you see the facade of the Spanish Inquisition. What is Inquisition? It comes from the root word to inquire. But this was more than inquiring. This was spying and forcing Jews to convert to Roman Catholicism. So what's happening during...
And you caught that right. They refer to Christopher Columbus as a Jew because this is a Jewish, documentation or documentary. And people say, yeah, we could be the original Jews. That's not exactly what this video is about. But as you can see, Christopher Columbus or Cristobal Colon had to convert. And the reason for the name change is probably because he was baptized by the Roman Catholics with a new name, Cristobal Colon, from his old name.
This time is that it's not so much the facade of religion to force people to convert. It was greed. It's because the crown, the King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella are going broke. They're exploring all over the place, wars all over the place. They need money. Yes. All right. So who's got the money? Who are the financiers? Who are the ones that are so wealthy in Spain and later Portugal? Well, the Sephardim, the Jews. Okay.
No. The Moorish Jews were broke too. That's why their empire fell. They had no money to continue ruling Spain and Europe as a whole. And then the Europeans didn't have any money because they just got finished fighting with the Moors. So where did people go to get more money to fund themselves? They came to America. That's why they sent Cristobal Colon to America. Before we go into Christopher Columbus being very greedy, and that is a characteristic of his that we hear a lot about with his obsession with finding gold, we're going to get into what Marano and Moreno mean, okay? So both the words Marano, M-A, and Moreno, M-O, are very similar to each other phonetically because they're both technically in reference to the Moors who ruled during that time, okay? And you could say here that Moor is technically short for Moreno, not necessarily short for Mauritania. And if Colon was said to be a spy, or said they didn't say they said that he was a spy to come over to America and spy and be reconnaissance for the crown, then how could he spy on a people he couldn't blend in with? So if we are copper colored over here in the Americas, how can you come over here and spy on us when you don't even look like us? Does that make any sense? Anybody? As you can see here, definition of moreno means brown, dark colored, dusky. Okay? Or dark, as in darker skinned. Marano, with an M-A, is a Christianized, like the guy was just saying, Jew or Moor. especially one who merely professed conversion in order to avoid persecution. That's what Cristobal Colon did, okay? Because he didn't want to lose all his wealth. He was a noble, probably a noble leftover from the Moorish Empire. He didn't want to lose that status. So, of course, he converted. Just like the Mayans over here, when the Spanish invaded South America and the Mayan Empire invaded us over here, you had a lot of the Mayan nobility that allowed themselves to be put up as the face of political power, as if they were still ruling the Mayan Empire, but they weren't. The Spanish conquerors put them up there because they knew if they put up a Spanish person up there, we'd act a fool, and we wouldn't allow that. And so they put up our noble people as a forefront so that we would still be tricked into thinking we're still under control, even though we're being invaded currently. Just like how you have all these black, quote unquote, black bourgeoisie put up as our so-called leaders, but they're not really for us. That's exactly what happened with the Mayan nobles. They didn't want to lose their high positions, and they didn't want to get killed if they said no. So they said, sure. We'll act as if we're still in control, while the Spanish were the ones who were in control of infiltrating the society. So we have to remember that the Moors were Islamic, okay? When they speak of the Christians taking over at the end of the 1400s, Christian is code for the Caucasians. And who sailed to America? Perhaps with the Nino brothers, who were also bronze sailors, who were born in Europe in 1492. It was Cristobal Colon, who again, he converted and agreed to sail to America for money, because he didn't have any money, because the Moors who were overthrown were broke. They lost their wealth, and Spain needed money because they were broke after the war too. So if we take a look here, we see, and so far, this, as I have found, this is the only legitimate painting of Cristobal Colon or Christopher Columbus as a bronze man, the only one that I could find. So the author or the painter goes by the name of Arthur Cadwgan Michael. So we're going to take a look at him for a second. But real quick before we do, we got to ask the question, why would an artist portray him as a bronze man? Why? Especially he did it around what? Early 1900s? Because this portrait was published in a book called This Country of Ours, A Story of the United States. And we're actually going to take a look in that book in a few minutes as well. So why would he portray Christopher Columbus as a bronze man? Because technically it's more historically accurate. This painter was not born in America, so he was not indoctrinated with Christopher Columbus being a Caucasian. Okay? And a lot of bronze people, or quote unquote black people, want him to be a Caucasian because it justifies us being a victim of the conquest. But the reality is, Cristobal Colon actually helped initiate those conquests, because the upcoming Caucasians who overthrew us in Europe, they didn't have the manpower, the firepower, or the finances to conquer us by force like how they teach us in school. So they'd have had to send spies and do espionage and reconnaissance and, kind of send them over here. Let's send somebody over to America that looked like them, because they knew that the Americans were copper colored. Because how else would we have gotten to Europe? How else would they have known what America was? Because remember, we have to put this into context. Hindustan, or the country that we know as India today, did not take on the name of India until the 1950s. So when they were talking about India in the 1400s, or basically before the 1900s, they were talking about America. So Christopher Columbus was not an incompetent sailor. He knew exactly where he was going. He knew he was heading towards America. It just wasn't called America at the time. It's called India. That's why the Indians are called Indians, because America used to be called India. And then when they started to conquer our lands over here and they integrated more into our cultures, then they started using a lot of our words from our languages. And so they borrowed the word that we use as America or Amurica or Murakan, and it became America. Now this is the painter of that painting. His name, again, is Arthur Cadwgan Michael. He was born in 1881 and died around 1965. This is a self-portrait that he did of himself, okay? This website is called acmichael.org. You're more than welcome to take a look at it. so that you can read this for yourself. This man was born in Swansea, that's the UK, okay? As you can see here, I'm scrolling through, he did not travel or live in the US. He lived in London, Spain, Guernsey, all those places. He did not travel to or settle in the US, so he was not indoctrinated with a Caucasian Columbus. He painted what was historically accurate and what he was taught, okay? So the painting was not satire, and it was not a joke, and it was not made to make fun of a people, because a painting was, again, actually put in that history book we're going to take a look at right now. You can download this book for free off of archive.org, archive.org, and it's called This Country of Ours, The Story of the United States by H.E Marshall. And it features this painting of bronze Christopher Columbus around page 53 or so. This book was published in 1917. This is a history book. This is not a satire book. This is legitimate. Okay? This is clearly a bronzeman, but if you read down here, it mentions the approach of the white men. Now, why would they describe the sailors, including Columbus, as white if he clearly is not? So we have to remember, look into the context, that back then in the 1400s and actually for a very long time, even until the 1800s, the early 1800s at least, there were no white people. There was no white race. Caucasians were not defined by a color. There were no black people. Okay? There were no black people. But if we take a look at the 1828 definition here, and you look up white, there is no mention of it describing a European or Caucasian in 1828. By the way, we use the 1828 dictionary a lot because it is the first comprehensive dictionary published in the United States. So it's the most accurate in terms of defining words that were used at that time around the early 1800s and even before then, okay? So as you can see here, there is no mention of a Caucasian at all. There isn't. But you know what definition is very interesting? In a scriptural sense, purified from sin or sanctified. As we read in Psalms 51:7, purge me with hyssop and I shall be clean. Wash me and I shall be whiter than snow. The whiter than snow does not mean your skin is literally going to turn white. It means that you have been purified mentally. That's why people would wear the white robes in ceremonies or even in Christianity. That's because it symbolizes being purified mentally. Okay, so when it talks about describing white people arriving, it's not necessarily that Caucasians were coming, it's Christians. And so we didn't know what race these people were unless they specified exactly where they're born and where they came from, or which isn't even as accurate, because back then you could say that Christopher Columbus was, so-called Italian perhaps, but obviously he was not a Caucasian. But at that time, you could say, I'm Italian. If you wanted to know what the person actually looked like, you had to describe their skin tone. But most people identified as their nationality, not their skin color. So if Christopher Columbus, I'm just going to call it Christopher Columbus, it's easier to say, was actually a bronze man, that should change our entire perspective on things. Because as you can see here, once they defeated the Moors, which ruled for about 800 years, as they say, they don't even talk about that history anymore. They just completely ignore it. They don't study it, and they claim not to even remember that happening, apparently. And they ignore it because they know it was us, okay? So we gotta ask, why would that documentary, or why would the painter even depict Colon as a bronze man, or that documentary say that he was a Marano in the first place? And why is the Met's Museum putting up an image of a man who they can't even say for sure isn't Cologne? And we know that isn't Cologne because that does not go historically with what he was described as. Okay? And just be aware that when people talk about, well, Christopher Columbus had slaves and he did a lot of horrible things. He cut people's hands and feet off if they didn't meet the gold quota and so on and so forth. Yeah, he did do that. And he was a bronze man doing that because back then, having slaves or even being abusive to people was not about race. He didn't look at us and was like, oh, this is my brethren, I can't do that to them. It wasn't about race, it's about status. And again, he was of the nobility. So he didn't care if he had to, betray or throw away Caucasians, bronze people, whoever he had to do, because he was broke. He was desperate. He was greedy. He was harsh, and he wasn't playing any games because this was his last chance to live the life that he lived before it all came crashing down with the Moorish Empire. And so remember, there are other books, especially the book called The American Discovery of Europe by Jack D. Forbes, that describe Christopher Columbus meeting and talking to Americans or bronze people who had actually sailed from here to Europe. So he had already been in contact with us over here. He knew we were over here. He knew we were good looking people. He saw the jewelry we had, and he knew there was gold over here because we had gold jewelry on. And some of us knew the language, obviously, and they told him, hey, there's gold over there. He wanted that gold. He didn't care who he had to kill or who had to torture or what he had to do in order to get it. And so that's part of our history too, our bronze or American history. Okay, that's not really Caucasian history. And like I said before, bronze people want Christopher Columbus to be a Caucasian because it justifies being a victim. But this is part of our history that we have to talk about because it happened. We had a bronze man who was greedy enough to do anything to get back the life that he had, come over here and torture his own people, and he did not care. He had no loyalty to us. He hadn't even lived over here. And again, back then, you allied with people based off of nationality, or within that nationality with other people of your same class or status. He was a noble person. He was a nobleman where he comes from. Coming over here, seeing us, some of us half naked and dressed, not as good as him apparently. He saw us as savages, and that's what he described us as, because that's what we were to him. He had lived a relative life of luxury before the Moorish Empire faded and he had to convert over to Roman Catholicism. So he wasn't too impressed by us as a people, other than the fact that we had riches over here that he wanted. And so, yeah, you could say that he betrayed us for the Spanish, or I'm sorry, not the Spanish, for the crown over in the UK, where it was Italy or whatever it was. You can say that because that's what actually happened. And so in conclusion, Christopher Columbus was a bronze man. He was not an incompetent sailor. He knew exactly where he was going. Again, India in 1492 was in reference to America. America was called India. That's why the inhabitants were called Indians. It wasn't until they mingled with us later on and more people were brought here and languages were exchanged that they decided to use one of our languages to describe the continent of America. That's when it changed from India to America. India, as the country we know of it today in Asia, did not become India to the 1950s. Before that, it was called Hindustan. That's why they have a Hindu religion. That's why they were referred to as the Hindustanis. The reason Christopher Columbus is portrayed as a Caucasian is because if they actually showed him as who he was as a bronze person, it messes up the notion of their manifest destiny. And it raises some questions, such as if we were African, and apparently every single copper-colored or bronze person was in Africa and nowhere else on the planet except as slaves, then how the heck did Christopher Columbus get to Europe, become a nobleman, and then a sailor? And it raises too many questions. And so that's why they chose some random person who they don't know who that is to put up as Christopher Columbus in the Met's Museum. It destroys a lot of their lies, a lot of things that they keep hidden or they just don't want to talk about, such as the Moors ruling Europe, such as us already being over here in America, and travel happening with us as a people worldwide, from Asia to Africa, to the Americas, to Europe, to even Antarctica. And even though Christopher Columbus was very harsh in his dealings with us over here and very greedy, the fact of the matter is, showing a bronze man who essentially helped Europe come out of poverty after the war, who sailed successfully over to America, found riches, and then brought it back, would give bronze men, women, and children a person of prominence to look up to, and would completely alter history. And then, or at least what people perceive history to be. And a lot of questions are going to come up about other things if they ever reveal publicly or ever admit that all this time they have lied about Christopher Columbus being bronze, being an incompetent sailor, not knowing where India was when he clearly did. It'll be real bad if they told the truth. So they're not going to tell the reality, okay? But you're going to get it here on the Ethnic American channel. Tune in for next time.